Now, this is 3. No sure you realize, isn't? Nope. Okay. I'm not sure you realize that. I know, why? If I consume Julie? Of course, until you didn't know this. I know, why? If I consume Julie? Of course. Until you didn't know this. Right. You did not point that. I know, why? Yep, if you consume Julie. Of course. Until you didn't know this. Nope. Okay. Did you realize that? Yep. Because I am not sure, Julie. Of course. Until you didn't know this. Right. You're not sure, realize that? Yep. If you consume, Julie. Of course. So you didn't know this? Nope. Okay. Not sure you realize that? Nope. Okay. Not sure you realize that? Yep. Okay. Because I'm not sure I realize that. Isn't? Nope. Okay. Not sure you realize that? Yep. If you assume, Julie. Of course. Until I didn't know this. Definitely. Right, yeah. Not sure I realize that? Yep. If I assume, Julie. If I'm not why? Yep. If I assume, Julie. Of course. Until I didn't know this. Right. You did not point that. I know, right? Yep. If you assume, Julie. Of course. Until I didn't know this. Right. Yeah, sure, isn't? Nope. If I assume, Julie. Of course. Not sure you realize that? Yep. If I assume, Julie. Of course. Until you didn't know this. I know, right? Yep. If I assume, Julie. Of course. If I assume, Julie. I know, right? Yep. If I assume, Julie. Until I didn't know this. Right. Not sure you realize that. Oh, not sure I realize that eventually. Of course. Until you didn't know this. Nope. Okay. Not sure you realize that. Yep. If I assume, Julie. Of course. Until I didn't know this. Right. Not sure you realize that. Yep. If you assume, Julie. Until I didn't know this. Right, yeah. You're not sure, isn't? Nope. If you assume, Julie. Of course. Until you didn't know this. Nope. If I assume, Julie. I was gonna be sure. Right. You did not point down for Julie? Of course. If I assume, Julie. Because I said so. Right. Let's gonna make sure. No, right? Yep. If you assume, Julie. Of course. So I realized that. If I assume, Julie. Until I didn't know this. And if I assume, right? Because I said so, Julie. Of course. Until you didn't know this? Nope. If you assume, Julie. And because I said so. Right. No sure realize that. Yep, if you could assume, Julie. Of course. Until you didn't notice. Nope. If you could assume, Julie. I was gonna make sure. Until I realized that. Julie. Right. Not sure you realize that. Yep. If I could assume, Julie. I was gonna make sure. Didn't. Nope. Okay. Not sure you realize that. Yep. Okay. Not sure you realize that. Yep. Okay. Not sure you realize that. Eventually. Because I said so. I was gonna make sure. Eventually. Because you was getting some radius. Of course. Until you didn't notice. Yep. Okay. Just gonna make sure you realize that. No way. Yep. If I could assume, really. And I was gonna make sure, isn't? Yep. If you could assume. Right. You did not Bunza. No. Right? Yep. If I could assume, really. And I was gonna make sure. No way. Yep. If I could assume, Julie. Of course. Until I didn't know this. Right. You did not Bunza. I know. Why? If I could assume, Julie. Until I didn't know this. Right. Not sure I realized that. Yep, if you can assume, Julie. Of course. Until I didn't notice. Nope. If you can assume, Julie. Why? We did not realize that. No way. Yep. If you can assume, Julie. Of course. Until I didn't notice. Why? Yeah, sure you realize that? Yep. If I could assume, Julie. Of course. Until I didn't notice, definitely. Why? You're not sure realize that? Yep. If I could assume, Julie. Of course. Until I realized that. Because I was gonna make sure. No way. Yep. If I could assume, Julie. Until I didn't notice. Right. If I could assume. I was gonna make sure I realized that. If I could assume, Julie. Of course. If I could assume. Yep. Until I didn't notice. Right. Did you realize that? Yep. No, sure you realize that? Yep. If I could assume, Julie. Of course. Until you didn't notice. Nope. If I could assume, Julie. If I was gonna be sure. Right. You did not want that. I know why. If I could assume, Julie. Of course. Until I realized that. If I could assume. Right. You did not point that. I know, right? If I could assume. Right? Because I said so? Right. You did not point that. I know, right? If I could assume, Julie. Heck course. Until you didn't notice. Yep. If I could assume, Julie. Of course. Until I didn't notice. Yep. If you could assume, Julie. Course. Until you didn't notice. Yep. If I could assume, Julie. Of course. Until you didn't notice. I know, right? If I could assume, Julie. Because I said so. Because I said so. Right, yeah. You know, sure you realize that? Yep. If I could assume, Julie. Of course. Until I didn't know this. Right. No, sure you realize that? Because I said so. Because I was gonna make sure I realize that, isn't? Yep, you could assume, Julie. Of course. Until you didn't know this. I know, right? Yep. If I could assume, Julie. If I was gonna make sure. I know, right? Yep. If I could assume, Julie. Until I didn't know this. Right. No sure realize that. Yep. If I could assume, Julie. Heck course. No sure you realize that. Yep. If I could assume, Julie. Heck course. Until you didn't notice. Nope. If I could assume, Julie. Of course. Until you realize that. Yep. If I could assume, Julie. Of course. Until I didn't notice. Right. You sure you realize that? Yep. If I could assume, Julie. Of course. Until you didn't notice. Nope. If I could assume, Julie. Of course. Until I didn't notice. Right. No sure you realize that? Yep. If I could assume, Julie. Of course. Until you didn't notice. Nope. If I could assume, Julie. Of course. Until you didn't notice. Nope. If I could assume, Julie. Until I didn't notice. Right. No sure realize that? Yep. Because I said so. Right. Because you have no idea. No, why? Yep. If I could assume, Julie. Of course. If I could assume. Yep. Bye. So you didn't know this? Nope. Okay. I was gonna make sure.